We've all been part of teams that we felt like really like kind of clicked. And ultimately, that's what asset management is trying to do within the federal government. Now, it's looking specifically through the lens of assets. But when you have stuff, assets, and those assets are there to serve a purpose, as an investor, you want to return an investment. But things like the federal budgeting process that looks at a short-term focus, which is okay and supports, the probably imminent threats, providing also future flexibility. But when it comes to long-lived assets, it's sometimes hard to understand the consequences of decisions being made, meaning if we're not doing enough sustainment or maintenance on these long-lived assets, it ultimately would be more expensive in the long run, especially when you're an organization that has a lot of long-lived assets, real property, transportation assets, a lot of your capital assets are very long-lived, and it's going to be better for all of us and across the generations the more we understand these relationships and can make better risk-based decisions on how we're doing things today.
If the federal government disappeared, it could take months before you'd know. But if local government disappeared, you would know the second you went to the washroom and tried to flush your toilet or get some water. What are the services that our community wants and needs now and into the future? And what are we willing and able to pay for? I worked in a community where they should have been spending $500,000 on road rehabilitation a year. They were spending $80,000 a year on road rehabilitation. And so what are the long-term consequences of that? And outlining, if we continue to ignore this is what our assets are going to look like, and paint that picture and use the data and the information about the state of the assets and telling the story about, and this is what it's going to look like. Sometimes when I end my asset management workshops, I will say, asset management is actually about love. Sometimes I'll have grown men bragging about their community and they're crying, and it's like, they love their community. They're there because they love their community. And so I remind them, channel that love by looking after the assets and services that you get to enjoy now, and make sure that future generations get to experience them as well. It's multi-generational thinking, and it's all about love.
Whether or not we call it asset management, this is here to stay, right? When I look at the problems that we've got across North America in terms of our, state of our infrastructure, particularly on a kind of public infrastructure front, what's happening at a kind of local government level, like we've got a huge problem. And, the only way for us to really have a massive impact on that is to train people like this at scale. So that's kind of where we're leaning more and more into that capacity building and training front, because it's such a big problem that we're seeing across the place. And, for us to make the biggest difference on the future, and, for us to be having long sustainable services going, not just next year or 5 years, but for the next generations, we need more people talking about this.
What we're seeing with asset management is that it's a very powerful institutional framework to address a lot of other issues. Those can include issues around climate change, community resilience, or issues around inclusion, about who has access to services and so forth. And asset management is powerful as a discipline because it's probably the only discipline within municipalities that takes a comprehensive look at all of your services and the assets used to provide those services.
So asset inspection services, right through to assessing performance based on risk, establishing lifecycle management plans, and recommending investments requirements for a long-term future. What's cool is by doing this now, it actually is allowing us to also start to think much more strategically about our physical infrastructure. So it's not just about managing assets, if I can say that, and doing traditional, say, life cycle engineering and reliability engineering type of approaches, which is important, but as well to starting for us to think as an organization, perhaps what businesses should we be in and what businesses shouldn't we be in. So we're stepping away from our assets themselves and starting to rethink our service model, and thinking maybe it's more appropriate for us to be onboarding third parties from an asset ownership perspective to identify maybe we can build a better relationship through a P3 or through asset monetization type of methods, and allow them to own the assets while we ultimately still own the strategy and the service requirement.
Let's be honest, for about 250 years at every level of our government, whether it was state or local, municipal, federal, we tended to operate by way of annual budget inputs instead of daily action outcomes. I've worked with Grant Thornton in states and local governments and counties all across the United States. We created a cadence of accountability around standards of openness and transparency and sharing our data. We told everybody, you can keep your individual silos if you like, as long as you can land the dots on the map so we can have an intelligent conversation every 2 weeks about what we're doing, whether we're doing it any better than we were 2 weeks ago. And so we can ask the honest questions about how we might coordinate, communicate, and collaborate in ways that allow us to accomplish our mission.